The Soul Redeemer, Book 1, Part 1, Bloodline, Chapter 2, Bloodlines. The year was 1889. The baby was a boy. Two dark angels hovered outside the house, as close to the room where the newborn slept safely in his mother's arms as possible. Their fear became reality as a third, larger, darker angel appeared. "I thought you had this under control," the newcomer hissed. The others both tried to make excuses simultaneously as to the reason they had failed to end this pregnancy, but were interrupted by the unexpected understanding of the third demon. "We have all misjudged the extent of his power over this bloodline. The High Council has already heard of your incompetence and has called a meeting to discuss options. I am to stay here and watch for any opportunity that might present itself for me to creep in and steal the life," explained the spirit of death. He knew the chances of that happening were minimal because the love of the parents for their God was strong, and their prayers had built hedges of protection around themselves and their home. Even now, while they were sleeping, the brightness of the shining angels protecting them caused Death to need his blinders, and he was outside of the house. At this point, he was relying on his senses to detect any point of weakness in the light, a chink in the armor through which he might be able to take advantage. He continued, "The two of you are to appear in court as soon as possible." The relief that had come through the understanding words of the dark angel a moment before quickly vanished as they contemplated their fate in the hands of the High Council. There was nothing they could do but obey, and as they swooped up and away, they conversed together, consoling one another. After all, they had worked together many times before and had been quite successful. That was why they had been assigned this important case. They were not mere peons in the Dark Kingdom. They were important spirits. Not at the top of ranking demons, but certainly not at the bottom either. Surely they would not be punished too severely, for after all, everyone experiences failure from time to time. This was the line of communication between them, until they came close to their destination, and fear began to overtake them once again. Their true nature of pride, preservation of self at all costs, began to emerge. Their consoling tones quickly ended and became a blame game as Infirmity assigned the responsibility of their failure to his companion Miscarriage, and vice versa. By the time they reached the courthouse, they were close to combat mode. "Order in the court!" shouted the acting judge. As the disciplinarian wolf-type spirits that were surrounding the room cracked their legendary whips, Infirmity and Miscarriage grew quiet and hung their ugly, misshapen heads in shame and fear. The judge continued. "Because of the failure of these two incompetent nincompoops, our job is to discuss options, not to punish them, although we hold the right to do so at a later time." Infirmity braved a glance around the room and witnessed the vile expressions of the demons looking back at them. He noted the look of anticipation as some were hungrily licking their lips at the mere thought of punishment, of violence, and he was grateful when the judge turned the focus of the meeting back onto the problem of the family. The judge continued. "As much as we'd all enjoy a mutilation right now, we need the input and information this team has gained through their watchfulness of and interaction with the people in this case." The courtroom erupted in loud exclamations of disappointment, and the judge beat his gavel on the podium and the whips cracked quickly, restoring order. "Court is now in session. Let's begin." It was established that this family had been under surveillance for generations. The baby boy was the concern at this moment, as were any other children that would be born to Sophia and Hans in the future. The mother's bloodlines had strong ties with the Illuminati and the occult. However, Sophia had rebelled and gone rogue. The father's family had been Christians for several generations, but because of curses of emotional distance, isolation, and spirits of disunity and resistance toward spiritual growth assigned to hide and protect those curses, his family had been kept in check until now. Their spirits may have belonged to the High King, and they may have been morally righteous, but there had been no real relationship with their Maker, no evidence of the one called the Holy Spirit. Sophia was the problem. She loved her Savior, and this love had been the reason that death had tried for years to steal her life. Her life was clearly guarded by the Holy One, and because of this and the many holy angels surrounding her, he was never able to get anywhere close enough to inflict his sting. It had finally come down to stopping her bloodline from continuing, and so infirmity and later miscarriage had been assigned to her. She was never supposed to be able to conceive a child or carry it to term if the unexpected happened and conception did occur. As the appointed speaker who had been recounting the family heritage summed up his research by declaring that it was love that seemed to be at the root of the problem, the whole court erupted into a frenzy of hisses and curses. Many began spitting up what looked like green pus out of their mouths, snouts, or beaks at the mention of that despicable word, love. The courtroom that had smelled badly before now reeked with a stench that was worse than an infected human limb full of gangrene when lanced. When the ranting and raging and stomping in the room subsided and order was reestablished, the High Court began searching through the generational bloodlines with hatred, a motivation that triggered a renewed vigor and determination to find any open door, no matter how small, that might allow them to reroute the current course of this family. Evaluating the father's side revealed more possibilities. In fact, there was a building of excitement in the room at the discoveries of open doors. Several generations before, there had been a shaman in the family, a woman actually. Her specific ruling spirits of defilement, witchcraft, and seduction had been eradicated from the next generation when her son had come in contact with some Christians and had converted to their faith. The court's hope became founded in the fact that the bones of defilement and his minions were still in place in the bloodline because of a curse the shaman had strategically positioned in them before she died. These curses blocked the Holy Spirit's seal from complete closure in that family's bloodlines and held the door open in waiting expectation. Before her death, the shaman had made a blood sacrifice of a perfect ram, the emblem and representation of Satan himself, and then mixed it with a stolen bit of her son's blood. In this way, the bloodlines of Satanism had been held open, waiting for the opportunity to become reestablished in hopes of cutting off the abhorred spiritual bloodline of Christ. The courtroom exploded with shouts of enthusiasm and anticipation. Breakthrough was imminent, and now was the time for planning. It would take patience and careful strategizing in order to mask the deception and stay hidden long enough to avoid exposure and risk of discovery. Sophia was a watchman and had the gift of discerning spirits. She was an intercessor and was connected with the heart and mind of the High King. She would not be easy to fool. To infirmity and miscarriage, it seemed that the interrogation process would never end, as they were questioned thoroughly regarding everything that could think of concerning Sophia and Hans that could possibly be of any help. The High Council came up with many plans, but none seemed to be the right one. That is, one they could all agree on, and that they could all foresee having the desired results. When the dissension in the court became uncontrollable, it was with much dread that the acting judge shouted the ultimatum he had been trying to avoid. He would call upon the presence of one higher in rank to come and decide upon their course of action. At this proclamation, the room grew silent. A little seeker, scanner, and eavesdropping spirits with big eyes and ears had done their job, for it was evident that I.S. was near before he was seen. The temperature seemed to drop, and the air filled with the tangible presence of evil that inspired dread even in the hearts of the spirits of fear. Awe and terror took on an image as I.S. slithered into the courtroom, full of power and confidence. There was none standing upon the arrival of I.S. A note to the reader: I.S. is pronounced as the letter I and then the letter S. His presence commanded reverence, complete respect, and immediate obedience. All bowed down before him, and no one dared to even glance at him. When he spoke, it was barely above a hissing whisper. "What is so difficult about killing a baby and its mother?" The serpentine-like creature floated up into the air, spread his wings, and wrapped them around himself. When he uncovered his body and retracted his wings, he descended onto the floor in the form of a man, a very delicious-looking, beautifully handsome man with refined features and slicked back black hair, dressed in black pants, shirt, and boots. Over his shoulders, covering his clothes, was a huge purple mantle or cape. There was something that caused one to evaluate the striking beauty of his face, for while it was obvious that it was predominantly masculine, there were also some feminine traits that were not as evident except upon further inspection. He could take any shape he chose, and he had many disguises, but this was his favorite. I.S. began pacing the length of the courtroom, taking note of all present. Miscarriage had never been in such close proximity to one so high up before. I.S. stopped directly in front of him and repeated the question a little more loudly this time. "What is so difficult about killing a baby and its mother?" Miscarriage did the only thing he could think of, and that was to blame the stronger of the two. "Your Honor," he blubbered, "it was Infirmity's fault. He was supposed to make her so sick that she would either die herself or be unable to conceive." "It's not my fault," Infirmity said as he kicked Miscarriage. "It was that woman. She—" "Enough!" The powerful roar emanated from I.S., who, without touching either one of them, picked them up, both by the scruff of their necks, and threw them across the room. Everyone was still bowing with their heads touching the ground, and no one gave in to the temptation of watching the display of violence. Infirmity and Miscarriage landed hard on their heads, and stayed right where they landed, fearing that any sign of movement might bring on more attention of the negative kind. Aya sauntered purposely over to the empty chair that had been previously occupied by the acting judge and sat down. After a moment or two, he said, "At ease. We have work to do. Tell me why this case has drawn so much attention, and I want all relevant information." The rest of the high court slowly rose, took their places, and were surprisingly quiet through the remainder of the meeting as the judge spoke for them, giving I.S. the information he asked for. He was careful to explain that the relationship between the mother and the High King was very strong, that her prayers were effective, that it had been prophesied that the boy's life, or those in his future bloodline, if not stopped, would lead many to freedom, which would result in many losses of those they held in captivity. I.S. contemplated all he had heard, then more to himself than anyone else he recalled. "I remember Lord Satan mentioning this very family. He had just come from one of his visits to the throne where he had been summoned." He was quiet a moment, and then he stood and said, "I need more understanding of this case." I.S. closed his eyes and projected himself toward the high place, the favorite earthly dwelling of his master. He arrived just as Satan was ready to begin his walk to and fro upon the earth. I.S. bowed low. "My master." "What is it that brings you here, I.S.? Rise and walk with me," the adversary said as he quickly pushed the huge ball and chain that was his constant companion out of the way. I.S. averted his eyes as his master rearranged his jewelry, as he had been known to call the tool of imprisonment that had been assigned him by the Creator. No one dared call attention to it, for no one dared provoke the wrath of one who desired to be and pretended to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and in all places at once, yet who lived with this daily reminder that he was not. "Your Highness, I am working on a case that I believe you are familiar with. You had overheard a prophecy in one of your visits to—" and he pointed upward. Impatiently, Satan replied, "Yes, yes, I know what you are referring to. I remember it well. It's interesting you should bring this up because I was just recently thinking about that case." He stopped walking and his dark eyes took on a faraway look. "I had been summoned, you know," he smirked. "Every time I pass through the great hall into the High King's throne room, I take much pleasure in spreading a stench of defilement. I know they can smell me coming a mile away," he resumed his stroll. "At any rate, I remember that day especially well because as the door of the throne room opened and I entered in, I caught a snippet of a prophecy over the very family you are working on. This was surprising to me, since they're usually very guarded about the words they say in my hearing. This prophecy is what led me to station death over that home." After a short pause, he continued, "I didn't let on that I had heard anything, and when I came before the king and he looked me in the eyes, I knew that he knew that I had heard. 'Satan, this will change nothing, you know,' he said. 'My blood runs strong, and my love runs deep within this bloodline.' I added that my seed ran just as deep, but he went on to say, 'You cannot change or stop my plans from bringing freedom to those you have taken captive. As time grows short, I am raising up a daughter within this very bloodline that will love me so much that through her obedience to me, I will crush you under her feet.' I was aware, of course, that every time a Christian obeys the king, I am trampled on and bruised, so to speak, by Jehovah God. But hearing it mentioned in context of a specific person in a specific bloodline let me know that this was a case to add to my watch list." He again stopped walking as the emotions of that day rose up within him. He had not replied out loud, and yet the Lord had known his prideful, rebellious thoughts. Thinking about that meeting now began to reawaken the murderous rage within him. Is was not easily intimidated. However, as he watched the change in his master's countenance, he began to wonder if he had made a mistake in coming. Satan's body began shaking in fury. "He is wrong, you know. I will stop this nonsense. I will not be crushed. I have my plans, and I will do the crushing." Is watched as his master began expanding in size until he had blown up like a red-hot balloon, and what began as an angry growl erupted into a violent roar that filled the earth, shaking it to the core in a devastating earthquake and killing 20 people in Kumamoto, Japan. Is was blown backward and knocked to the ground. When all was quiet and he dared look toward his master, he was shocked to see how calm he was. Satan was standing serenely with his hands behind his back as he looked out over the land. "What is being done about this matter?" Satan asked. Is slowly stood to his feet, but kept the distance between them as he answered, "We are working on a plan at this moment. I left the courtroom and came to you, seeking for a more clear understanding of this case. I believe that I have acquired what I came for, Your Highness." "Is?" "Yes, my master." "Do not fail me. I perceive that if not stopped, this bloodline may have negative effects on our strategy concerning the great plan." Is bowed low again. "I understand, my lord, and we will not fail you." And with that said, Is propelled himself back into the courtroom, where the demons were in the process of picking themselves up off the floor, and blasphemous words flowed freely around the room, for the earthquake had been experienced in the spiritual as well as the physical realm. He had only been absent for a rift in time, but already a plan had begun to form within his mind. He took his seat behind the bench and banged the gavel, gaining attention. When all was quiet, he began to explain the new plan of action that would take years to accomplish, but that he was certain would prove to be successful. The new plan would take advantage of the shaman's curse and reintroduce witchcraft and the occult back into the bloodline. He explained that though the goat had died, the parasites that had been feeding on it were alive and well, in hibernation until they were needed. He said that they were comparable to seeds awaiting their time of germination, only these were spirits awaiting their time of action. That time was now. They had the capability to infest and infect those who were weak and vulnerable, ignorant of their presence, complacent, or those who disbelieved in the relevance of the prince's power in the heavenly places. Once they had been given an assignment and had infected the subject, they would begin to grow in strength and power. Is assigned parts of the plan to each one of the High Council and left it to them to assign specific jobs to certain demons. Just before leaving the courtroom, Is turned back toward the judge and asked, "Just for the record, what is the baby's name?" "David." With a crooked smile of knowing, he said, "Of course," and strode back out the way he had come. Once, years back in the history of the world, there had been another boy named David, whose bloodline had been the strongest, most protected bloodline that Is had ever encountered. It had been predetermined that the boy would be a king, and the prophecy surrounding his lineage had been an even greater king would be born to him. Is hated recounting the memories of his greatest failure, the failure to stop the prophecy from becoming reality. Even though this new bloodline reeked with similarities of the other, he refused to beat himself up. He comforted himself with the commitment that this time he would not fail.